I was standing near the Champagne Tower when my son-in-law David made the joke. I remember the exact moment because everything seemed to slow down for a second, the way it does when something lands wrong, but you can't quite respond fast enough. I'd been talking to my daughter Sarah's college friend about the weather, or something equally forgettable, and I didn't notice David gathering the attention of the people nearby. That's how it always works with him. He's got this instinct for an audience, like he's been rehearsing his entire life for moments to be the centre of attention. He raised his voice, that half-laughing, half-serious tone he uses when he's about to say something cruel and wants plausible deniability afterward. He said it loud enough that I heard it from across the room. Don't put him in any of the main photos, would you? He makes everything look depressed. Nobody wants to look at their wedding photos and think about mortality, you know. The photographer, a young woman named Claire, laughed nervously. So did some of the guests. Not everyone. I caught a few people glancing in my direction, their smiles faltering, unsure if they were supposed to participate in this particular form of humiliation. One of Sarah's uncles looked visibly uncomfortable. Her cousin Mark shook his head, but most of them laughed. Most of them had already decided my presence was an inconvenience to their party, and David had just given them permission to think it out loud. My daughter didn't laugh. She shot me this look, that protective daughter look that mixed apology and fury. But she didn't say anything either. She never does. Not in the moment. Later she'll apologize. Later she'll say she should have stood up to him. But standing there in her wedding dress, surrounded by 200 people and a photographer hired to document the best day of her life, Sarah made the calculation that peace was more important than defending her father. I understood the math. I just didn't enjoy the answer. I felt something shift in my chest, something hard and cold settling in where my stomach used to be. I set down my champagne flute on a nearby table, very carefully, like it was made of glass. I know that's an odd detail to notice, but I did. Very carefully. I could feel the pressure building behind my eyes, that particular heat that comes from being humiliated in front of people you don't know that well, which somehow makes it worse than if it were just family. At least with family you can yell. With acquaintances and distant cousins and your daughter's work friends, you're supposed to just smile and move on. That's what men my age are supposed to do. Absorb the hit and pretend it never landed. So I gave them what they wanted. I put on a face that suggested the joke had sailed right past me, that I was completely unaware I'd been made the target. Sarah was in her wedding dress, radiant and nervous the way brides are, and I could see her wrestling with whether to make a scene. I made the decision for both of us. I walked out of the reception room and into the hallway, my dress shoes clicking against the polished floors of the hotel. I didn't slam any doors or make any grand theatrical exit. I just left quietly, the way you do when you realize you're not wanted somewhere. I walked past the gift table where flowers were arranged, past the coat check, into a corridor where the noise of the party faded to background hum. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket once I was in the hallway, away from the ambient noise of the party. My hands were shaking a little, which I didn't expect. I'm not typically a shaking hands kind of man. I'm the kind of man who stays calm when people are coding, when their families are screaming, when everything is falling apart. But I was shaking now. I stood there for a moment, looking at the phone, thinking about who to call and what I wanted to accomplish. I knew exactly what I wanted. I just wanted to make sure I could actually do it, so I made the call. When I came back into the reception room 15 minutes later, the photographer, Claire, approached me almost immediately. She looked uncomfortable, like she'd been drafted into something against her will. I don't blame her. Wedding photographers are just trying to take pictures and collect paychecks. They're not diplomats. She told me that the wedding planner wanted to speak with me, and he was waiting in the office area near the main entrance. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. That's when I knew something had changed, that the situation had shifted in some way. I thanked her and walked over there, my mind running through the conversation that was about to happen, trying to anticipate the angles he might take. The wedding planner, a man named Gerald, was standing in the office when I arrived. He looked nervous. Gerald is the type of man who's good at his job when everything's going smoothly, but falls apart the moment anything unexpected happens. He had his phone in his hand and he held it up like he was showing me evidence of something important. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "your payment of $42,000 just cleared. The package is yours. All of it." He said it like I'd be happy about this, like maybe I'd forgotten that I'd already paid him months ago. But I had paid him months ago. The initial payment had been made back in October. The invitation to this meeting wasn't really about confirming payment, it was about confirming that I now owned something. Gerald was visibly uncomfortable. I could see him calculating the implications of what had just happened. Somewhere in his system his notes now reflected that a second shareholder had purchased the complete premium package, that a second stakeholder had rights to the documentary footage, that a second voice now had authority over how this wedding would be remembered and recorded. I smiled, and I watched his face shift as he realized that my happiness and my action weren't connected to each other. They were independent variables. The money had gone through because I'd wanted it to. Not because anything forced it, not because I needed approval. I'd called my bank, verified funds, authorized the transfer, and then made a phone call that I knew would reverberate through the rest of this day. Gerald was starting to understand that something significant had changed about the structure of power at this wedding. He was starting to understand that he now had two clients with potentially competing interests, and I was going to be very interested in how those conflicts resolved. During those 15 minutes in the hallway, I did what I'd done for 42 years. I assessed the situation. I thought about the problem systematically. I didn't panic. I didn't rage. I thought about Margaret, who would have been furious at David, who would have told me exactly what to do. I thought about the implications of what had just happened. I was being publicly erased. The photographic record of my daughter's wedding would not include me. Historically, I would not exist in this moment. And then I thought, maybe that's not acceptable. Maybe I don't have to accept that. The hallway was quiet. There was a water station, and I stood there for a moment. I thought about whether I actually had any options. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I could do. And I realized I'd been stupid not to see this coming. David had been systematically removing me from every frame, every moment, every documented memory. This was just the logical conclusion. This was him saying it out loud. And if I did nothing, if I accepted this gracefully like a good father and a dignified older man, then he'd won. He'd successfully erased me. I'd had access to information, and I'd been passively receiving information instead of actively using it. But I could change that. I'd made calls. I'd called the vendor contacts my daughter had provided months ago for the reception. I'd called the photographer's agency directly and spoken to the booking coordinator, a woman named Lisa who was professional and efficient. I'd called the hotel's event services manager, Marcus, who I'd actually met during a venue tour several months ago. These weren't theoretical conversations. I had account numbers and authorization codes from the wedding planning documents Sarah had shared with me over the past year. I knew how to navigate the infrastructure because I'd been peripherally involved in planning for months. Or rather, I'd been kept just informed enough to feel included while being systematically excluded from actual decision-making. Now I was using that information differently. I'd purchased the exclusive photography package, the special videographer angle, the premium wedding album, the rehearsal dinner documentation, and most importantly, the private family session rights. $42,000 worth of wedding infrastructure. It sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but I'd spent 15 minutes in that hallway thinking about what I actually wanted, and I'd realized it wasn't revenge exactly. Revenge is something you do to someone else. This was different. This was investment. This was establishing boundaries with paperwork and contracts. This was saying through the language of money and vendor agreements that I was still relevant, that I still had agency, that I could not be eliminated. The photographer now worked for me during the private session, which meant she photographed whoever I wanted photographed and didn't photograph whoever I didn't want photographed. The videographer had explicit instructions about whose family section would be included in the final edit. The wedding album that went home with Sarah would have photographs curated by a MN, already stakeholder in the wedding, by me. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 67 years old. I spent 42 years as an emergency room physician at Vancouver General Hospital. 42 years is a long time to show up to the same place and see crisis after crisis. You learn things in the emergency room that don't typically get taught in medical school. You learn that people are unpredictable. You learn that the relationships you think are solid can break under pressure. You learn that when someone is drowning, they'll do anything to save themselves, including pushing down whoever is trying to help. Most of all, you learn to stay calm. I spent most of my adult life dealing with crisis situations, making split-second decisions that affected people's lives, learning to keep my voice steady when everything around me was falling apart. I had colleagues who couldn't handle it. They'd burn out or transfer to other specialties, I just got better at compartmentalizing, better at separating the emotional weight of human suffering from the practical requirements of treating it. I retired 6 years ago after Margaret, my wife, had a stroke. It wasn't a catastrophic one. She survived it with minimal damage, actually. Her speech was fine, her cognition intact, her mobility nearly normal. But it scared us both. We'd thought we had more time. We'd put things off, delayed trips, figured we'd get around to them later when work was less demanding. People do this. They live like later is a promise instead of a maybe. The stroke was the universe pointing out that later doesn't actually exist. So I stepped back from medicine. I stopped taking shifts immediately and transitioned over 3 months. Then I was done. 42 years, and then I was handing off my last patient to the night shift and walking out of the hospital for the last time. I thought retirement would be peaceful. I thought Margaret and I would travel, go to Italy like we'd been saying since 1995, visit her sister in Toronto more often. I'd joked for years about getting a boat, spending time on the water, reading books without my pager going off. Margaret wanted to spend time in the garden. She was always talking about redesigning it if she had the time. Turned out she had the time. She spent 6 hours a day with her hands in the dirt and her mind at peace. I was jealous of that sometimes, the way she could just sit and be present with something growing. I had trouble with the stillness. 42 years of emergency medicine teaches you that motion is the default state. Stillness means someone's not getting better. In the ER, if you're not moving, the patient is probably dying. So I never learned how to just be. I had trouble adjusting to a life where doing nothing was acceptable, and then I watched David take advantage of that restlessness in me. He'd see me struggling to find meaning in retirement, and he'd use it against me. He'd make jokes about how I must be bored, how I must miss the importance of my old life. It never occurred to him that I might be looking for meaning somewhere other than work. It never occurred to him that I might have hobbies or interests. It occurred to him that I was a target. Sarah was our only child. She was a lawyer, smart, driven, with her mother's patience and her father's inability to stop working. She'd graduated law school in the top 5% of her class and gone into corporate law, which meant she worked 80 hours a week and talked about her cases with intensity, suggesting she'd personally recruited each legal argument. I used to worry about her in the way that parents do, thinking she was burning herself out too young, following the same pattern I'd followed, trading life for ambition. But Sarah seemed happy in her work. She had this sharp intelligence that made her dangerous in a boardroom, and she knew it. When she was younger, maybe 15 or 16, she asked me about the ER, about how I handled making life and death decisions. I tried to explain the clinical side, the protocols and procedures. She asked something smarter than that. She asked, "Dad, when you have to tell someone their family member died, how do you do that without breaking?" I didn't have a good answer. I gave her something about professional distance. She looked at me like I'd missed the point, which I had. When she met David in her office, he's a senior partner at the same firm, I thought it was a cliché stepped directly from television. Lawyer meets lawyer. They date, get engaged, plan a wedding. The whole thing felt inevitable. I kept my opinions to myself because that's what fathers do when their daughters are adults. Sarah had a good head on her shoulders. She could make her own decisions. Margaret didn't have the same restraint. She'd say things like, "He seems very focused on himself," which is Margaret speak, for I don't trust him. Margaret was usually right about people. She had this way of seeing through someone's exterior to what they actually were underneath. She said David was performative, always conscious of how he was being perceived. A man like that, she said, would do anything if he felt his image threatened. It was Margaret who first pointed out that David seemed to diminish people around him, that he needed to be the most impressive person in any room. I didn't argue with her. I just tried to be supportive of Sarah and cordial with David, which isn't the same as warm but is professionally acceptable. From the beginning, David had a habit that bothered me, though I didn't see it as a pattern at first. He made jokes with a kernel of meanness underneath, the kind that work because everyone's supposed to laugh along, and if you don't, you're the problem. He'd make comments about my retirement at dinner parties, how it must be nice doing nothing all day, wasn't I bored? Didn't I miss the stimulation? The implication being that retired people are useless, that we're just waiting for the end. Once he asked me what I did with all my free time, and when I mentioned volunteering at a community health clinic, he said, "Oh, so you're still working then?" Like he'd caught me in a contradiction, like I was failing at retirement by not being completely useless. He'd joke about my face, how I always looked tired or stern or disapproving. He did this thing at Thanksgiving dinner last year where he pointed at my expression while I was listening to Margaret tell a story, and he said, Robert looks like he's trying to figure out how to bill us for his time. Everyone laughed. I laughed too because that's what you do. He'd talk about how I didn't contribute much to family discussions, which was factually presented but undercut with the suggestion that I was boring or out of touch. He'd ask me about emergency medicine, seeming genuinely interested, get me started on a clinical topic, and then interrupt before I finished to change the subject, like he'd suddenly remembered he didn't actually care. It's behaviour too subtle to fight directly. You can't call someone out for implying you look tired, because then you're the sensitive one, the one who can't take a joke. David was always careful to smile while doing it, always careful to make it seem like good-natured ribbing between family members, but there's something about being consistently diminished by someone in your own family. It's like being erased in small moments that add up over time, each one small enough to ignore individually, but collectively devastating. It's like watching someone you're supposed to love slowly remove you from the picture. This wedding planning started about a year ago when Sarah and David got engaged at New Year's. They moved quickly into planning, saying they wanted something elegant and sophisticated, something reflecting their place in the legal community. I understood what that meant. It meant no expense spared, everyone polished and perfect, a display of success. Margaret and I were invited to planning meetings, though increasingly those meetings seemed to have happened before we arrived. Sarah would tell us decisions had been made and we'd nod and accept them. David had opinions about everything. The venue needed to be downtown and modern, nothing traditional. The colour scheme had to be sophisticated, nothing too warm or feminine. He mentioned offhandedly that his parents were dealing with financial issues so couldn't help fund the wedding, meaning David had stepped in, meaning because he was contributing financially, his vision took precedence. I started noticing things during the process. How Sarah would ask my opinion about something small, then check with David before committing. How David would favour certain aesthetic choices and suddenly everyone wanted those choices. He had this way of presenting his preferences as established facts. We'd show up to planning meetings and he'd say, "So we've decided on the Westin," like there had been some collective decision-making process, when really David had decided. And because he was involved and financial and present, nobody wanted to argue. I watched my daughter become smaller during this process, consulting David before responding to vendors, asking his permission before committing to details. I watched her become less like the sharp lawyer who'd ask me profound questions about how to break difficult news, and more like someone managing her partner's expectations. It was subtle. It wasn't like David issued orders or anything overt. It was more that his preferences became everyone's preferences through the power of his personality. Sarah would suggest something, and David would respond with a skeptical comment, and then she'd withdraw the suggestion. She was learning. She was learning what it meant to be married to someone who needed to control everything. When the engagement photos came out, I was in exactly one, and even then I was partially obscure, D by Sarah's mother. Sarah told me David had requested the photographer do that. She apologised while telling me this, which was the worst part somehow. My daughter was apologising for her fiancé's cruelty to her father. I told her it was fine, I didn't mind. These things happen. That's what I said about being deliberately cropped from engagement photos. These things happen, but it was happening. It was all happening and I was watching it happen, and I was choosing not to make a scene about it because making a scene would hurt Sarah more than accepting the cruelty would hurt me. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that I didn't know how to fight this kind of war. Direct confrontation seemed like the wrong move. It seemed like it would make Sarah's life harder. So I accepted. I absorbed. I waited, except it was hurting me. Every small exclusion was like a cut, and the cuts were adding up. Every time David diminished me in front of other people, it was another cut. Every time Sarah didn't defend me, it was another cut. And the bleeding was slow, but it was consistent. Now 6 months later, we were at the actual wedding, and David had apparently decided that even deliberate cropping wasn't enough. He wanted me gone from the photos entirely. He wanted me present because Sarah needed her father to walk her down the aisle, because there's still something about tradition that even David couldn't completely discard, but he wanted me erased from the documentation. He wanted the visual record to show David had married into a family of the acceptable and beautiful, not a family that included an old man who'd made the mistake of aging. He said this publicly. He made it a performance. He wanted the photographer to hear it. He wanted me to hear it. He wanted witnesses to my irrelevance. and my brilliant lawyer daughter said nothing. She stood there in her dress and said nothing. She made the calculation that managing her father's hurt was more important than defending him, or maybe she made the calculation that managing her fiancé's comfort was more important than supporting her father. Either way, she chose silence. That's what his strategy had accomplished. It had reached into my family and taught them that it was acceptable to diminish me. It had created a precedent. It had established that the cost of supporting me was higher than the cost of abandoning me. The reception continued around me like I wasn't there, which I suppose was the point. I stood with a champagne flute I wasn't drinking from, watching David command attention at different tables, telling stories with his hands moving in those deliberate gestures he practiced in front of the mirror. I'd seen him do it at home when Sarah wasn't looking, running through anecdotes about his cases, testing his delivery. Now he was doing it for the assembled guests, and they were eating it up because that's what people do. They see confidence and they assume competence. They see someone performing expertise and they believe the performance. David had mastered the theatre of it. The ceremony had been beautiful, which was the problem. Sarah had looked radiant walking down the aisle on my arm, and Avid had cried at just the right moment, and everyone had felt the emotional impact of it because they were supposed to. 42 years in emergency medicine taught me to recognize when someone is performing wellness instead of experiencing it. David hadn't cried because he was overwhelmed with love. He'd cried because he'd calculated that tears at that specific moment would hit the right note. He was a musician playing an audience, and the audience was swaying to his tune. I understood what he was doing because I'd spent decades watching people perform versions of themselves for observers. But I'd also learned something else over those 4 decades, that performance eventually breaks down under sustained pressure, that eventually reality reasserts itself, that everyone has an architecture of lies they build to sustain their preferred narrative, and that architecture always has weak points. I'd watched David construct his architecture carefully over 5 years of dating Sarah. I'd watched him build the story of himself as the successful lawyer, the ambitious developer, the man who was going to take Sarah to places she'd never been. I'd watched him tell that story so convincingly that Sarah had believed it, that my daughter had believed it. And I'd watched him reinforce that narrative by systematically removing anyone who might contradict it, anyone who might suggest that he wasn't as impressive as he claimed to be. That's where I came in. I was old. I'd retired. I'd relinquished my status as a practicing physician. To David, I represented a cautionary tale about irrelevancy. I represented everything he was afraid of becoming, so he had to diminish me preemptively. He had to make sure that nobody would take my perspective seriously. He had to establish that my presence was a liability rather than an asset. I'd watched the whole ceremony from the front row, watched Sarah glance at me, reassured by my presence, reassured that her father was there even if her fiancé's family was barely acknowledging mine. David's parents sat 3 rows back, which told you something about the family dynamics there too. His mother looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, like she was enduring this event as penance for something. His father had the kind of tense jaw that suggested untreated stress, and probably untreated something else. I'd seen enough people in crisis to recognize the signs. Whatever was happening in that family, David had clearly learned that cruelty was an acceptable coping mechanism. He'd learned to make himself feel powerful by making other people feel small. That's what the joke had been, a bout. It wasn't really about the photos. It was about establishing dominance at what was supposed to be Sarah's day. But Sarah had been so happy to have a wedding at all that she'd accepted the reframing of it as David's accomplishment rather than her own milestone. That was his real skill, I think. Not the cruelty itself, but his ability to make the people around him complicit in accepting it. The moment he'd made the joke, I'd realised something important. I'd realised that I'd been positioned by everyone around me into a role of silent acceptance. My role was to be the aging father, the one who absorbs slights and moves on, the one whose hurt doesn't matter because his days are supposedly numbered anyway. That's what the joke had really been about. It wasn't just about photographs. It was about establishing the hierarchy of whose presence mattered, and whose presence was merely tolerated. David was saying that his comfort at this event was more important than my dignity. He was saying that my face was an aesthetic problem that needed to be hidden. He was saying that I was the problem, not his cruelty. And everyone had agreed with him through their laughter. Everyone had decided that his joke was funny because it was technically about something I couldn't argue with. How do you argue with someone who says you look depressed? You can't. You can only absorb the implication that your very existence is bringing down the energy of the event. I'd stood there feeling something crystallize inside me, some realization that I'd been accepting this for months, that I'd let David's small cuts accumulate until they'd formed a landscape of hurt that I was just supposed to smile through. Walking back into the reception after I'd made the phone call, I'd felt different. I'd felt like I'd injected myself with something, some kind of counteragent to the poison of that joke. I'd been drowning and I'd kicked to the surface. Gerald's confirmation of the payment had been the sweetest thing I'd heard in months. I'd bought my way into the infrastructure. I'd bought agency. I'd bought the right to refuse. Margaret would have laughed and told me I'd thought like a businessman instead of like a man, and she would have been right. But she also would have understood that sometimes you need to speak in the language of money and contracts when words alone have failed, when silence has been accepted as consent. I had resources. I had decades of savings from 4+ decades in emergency Edison. I had access to information systems. I had the kind of knowledge that only comes from being peripherally involved in something for months while appearing to be fully informed. I knew the vendors because Sarah had talked about them. I knew the pricing structures because I'd watched the budget documents get updated throughout the planning process. I knew the decision makers because I'd attended planning meetings, even the ones where I was quietly sidelined in favour of David's opinions. All of that information could be weaponized. All of it could be converted into leverage. The reception moved through its programmed sequences, each one choreographed and controlled. The first dance happened around 8 o'clock. I watched David spin Sarah across the floor, and I could see him calculating how long to hold her, when to smile at the photographer, when to look smitten. Every movement was engineered. Margaret used to say that you could tell a lot about a man by how he danced, whether he was leading or performing. David was doing both. He was leading Sarah through the motions while simultaneously curating the image of himself leading her. The photographer caught it all, and I understood for the first time why my presence in the photographs had bothered him so much. Because a photograph is a frozen moment, and frozen moments have power. They don't change or soften with time the way memories do. A photograph of me at this wedding would be permanent proof that I existed in this moment, that I was part of the family regardless of whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it. That was terrifying to David because photographs are evidence, they're historical documents, they're the proof that submits to no argument. I'd spent weeks leading up to the wedding understanding what was happening. Sarah had kept me informed about the planning in the careful way that daughters do when they're trying to keep their fathers feeling included, without actually including them in any meaningful decisions. She'd send me the venue information, the colour scheme selections, the details about timing, and then David would make decisions that contradicted all of that. He'd suggest different fonts for the programmes. He'd question the flower arrangements. He'd push for a particular hotel despite Sarah having already chosen a different one. And bit by bit the wedding had become David's wedding. Sarah was the prop, beautiful and necessary but ultimately decorative. That's when I'd started paying attention. That's when I'd realized that this wasn't just going to be Sarah's wedding, it was going to be David's victory lap. And the way he'd structured it, the way he'd systematically removed me from the visual record, the way he'd made clear that my presence was tolerated but not wanted, all of it was part of his conquest. He was marrying into a family and immediately establishing dominance. He was showing everyone that he controlled the narrative of what this marriage meant. The joke about the photographs was just the clearest articulation of something he'd been doing all along. He'd been writing me out of the story. I'd made my phone calls during those 15 minutes in the hallway, and I'd been very specific about what I wanted. I'd called the photographer's agency and spoken to Lisa, the booking coordinator. I'd called the hotel's event manager, Marcus, someone I'd actually met during a venue tour months earlier. I'd verified my account numbers and authorization codes from the wedding planning documents Sarah had shared with me. I'd purchased the exclusive photography package, the videographer angle, the rehearsal dinner documentation, and most crucially the private family session rights, $42,000. It was money I'd accumulated through decades of emergency room shifts, money I'd planned to use for travel or repairs or grandchildren. Instead, I was using it as a weapon, or not a upon exactly a tool. A way of saying that I wasn't going to be erased without resistance, that I had the resources to fight back, that my presence wasn't something that could be dismissed as background noise. The arrangements were specific because I'd thought them through carefully during those 15 minutes, when I was alone in the hallway of the hotel. I'd stood there, my dress shirt still perfectly pressed, my jaw clenched so hard I could feel it in my temples, and I'd calculated exactly what would hurt David the most. It wasn't money for its own sake. David spent money he didn't have all the time. It wasn't public confrontation because David would just spin that into a narrative where he was being attacked unfairly. It was the photography. It was the documentation. It was the official record of what had happened today. Because photographs are the truth that nobody can argue with. You can dispute a memory, you can reframe a conversation, but a photograph exists and it doesn't lie. A photograph taken by the professional photographer hired for the wedding is part of the historical record. It's what gets printed. It's what gets handed down. It's what Sarah will show her own children someday. David understood that intuitively, which is why he'd been so focused on keeping me out of them. I understood it too, which is why I was now going to ensure that the photographs that mattered most didn't include him. Claire, the photographer, found me near the bar around midnight. The reception was winding down, but not finished. She looked nervous, which was understandable. She'd been put in an incredibly awkward position when David made his comment, and she probably still wasn't sure if she'd handled it correctly. She'd smiled nervously when he made the joke, looking to Sarah for guidance about whether this was acceptable banter or genuine cruelty. Sarah hadn't corrected him, which Claire had interpreted as tacit approval. Now she was second-guessing that interpretation. She said, "Mr. Hayes, I need to clarify something about the private family session. Gerald told me there were changes to the arrangement. I confirmed there had been. I explained that I'd purchased the premium package, which gave me exclusive control over the composition and final editing of the private session photographs." She said, "So you're deciding who gets included?" I looked across the ballroom at David, who was laughing with his best man, his arm around him in that performative buddy embrace. I looked at him standing there, so pleased with himself, so confident that he'd successfully diminished me. I looked at Sarah standing nearby, wearing her wedding dress, looking tired despite the smile she was maintaining. I looked at all of it and I said, everyone except him and his family. I want photographs of Sarah with her mother's family, with the people who actually showed up for her without conditions or performances. The private session, the ones that get printed and framed and become the official record of this day, those photographs should show Sarah with people who actually love her without qualification. Not with someone who publicly humiliated her father at her own reception. Claire's face went white. She understood what I was doing. She understood that this wasn't about photographs anymore. This was about rewriting history. This was about using the infrastructure of the wedding against the person who'd thought he controlled it. I was using money and contracts as a language to say something that words couldn't accomplish. I was excluding him from the visual record of his own marriage in the photos that would endure. I was ensuring that when Sarah looked back at these pictures in 20 years, in 50 years, she would see only the family that had loved her unconditionally. She would not see the man who'd tried to erase her father because he was insecure about his status in her life. Claire said quietly, That's very specific." I told her it was. I told her that specificity was what I'd paid $42,000 for. I told her that sometimes people need to understand that there are consequences for public humiliation. I told her that sometimes exclusion is the only language that reaches someone who doesn't respond to words. I continued. The rehearsal dinner photographs, the ceremony photographs, those are documented. David will be in those. Everything is there. Everything is preserved. But the private family session, the ones that matter most, the ones that become the official record of family moments, the ones that get printed and framed and displayed in homes for generations, those belong to my curation now. And I'm curating them to reflect truth instead of performance. The truth is that Sarah married a man today, yes, but the truth is also that her father showed up for her despite being publicly humiliated, despite being told his presence was an aesthetic problem. That's the truth I want documented, you understand? She nodded slowly. She said, "I'll need to confirm with the bride about this arrangement." What? I told her that was appropriate. I told her to mention that her father had made additional investments in photography and wanted to ensure the final products reflected authentic family relationships. I didn't need Sarah to approve it beforehand. I needed Sarah to have plausible deniability. I needed her to be able to say that she didn't specifically authorize this, that her father had taken matters into his own hands. That way, when David found out, he couldn't blame Sarah. He'd have to blame me, and his complaint would have to be against me, not against his new wife. I was protecting Sarah by taking the fall. The night wore on. Dinner had been served on plates so expensive I didn't want to know the cost per head. David had given a toast that was perfectly calibrated for maximum charm, hitting every note of self-deprecation and genuine seeming emotion at exactly the right moments. People had laughed and cried at appropriate intervals. Sarah had glowed under his attention, not realizing that his attention was a performance, that he was curating her experience just like I was now curating her photographs. That was the thing about people like David. They understood that reality was just another thing to be shaped and controlled. They understood that what actually happened mattered far less than the narrative that got constructed afterward. The problem was that I'd spent 42 years in crisis situations where reality couldn't be shaped, where what actually happened was the only thing that mattered, where performance didn't save lives and narrative didn't stop bleeding. I'd learned a different language than the one David spoke. I'd learned the language of consequence and accountability, and I was going to speak it now in the only way I knew he'd understand. I thought about Margaret during the toasts. Margaret would have done this differently. Margaret would have stood up during David's speech and called him out. She would have said something cutting and true, something that would have made everyone uncomfortable but would have been honest. She would have refused to participate in the fiction that this day was a celebration when it had been, for me at least, a systematic attempt to erase my participation. But Margaret wasn't here. Margaret had left me alone to navigate this, to figure out my own way of fighting back, and I was choosing to fight back through documents and contracts and the official record of what happened. I was choosing to win by making sure that history, as it was documented in the photographs that would outlast all of us as remembered me as someone who'd shown up even when I'd been told I was unwanted. I was ensuring that David would have to live with that every time Sarah looked at the wedding photographs. I was ensuring that the man who'd tried to erase me would find his own erasure staring back at him from the pictures on Sarah's living room wall. Sarah found me around 1 a.m, after most guests had left. The ballroom was being cleared by the hotel staff, and the last remaining family members were heading toward the exits. She found me standing near the window, looking out at the city lights below the hotel. She said, "Dad, what exactly did you do?" There was something in her voice that wasn't quite anger, but something adjacent to it, something that mixed relief and shame. Her hair was coming down from its updo, and her dress was creased from sitting and dancing and the accumulated weight of a 12-hour event. She looked exhausted. She looked like she'd aged 5 years since this morning. I told her I'd ensured that the photographs of her family moments would reflect the family that had actually shown up for her. I told her that sometimes protection requires making hard choices about who gets to be remembered as part of important moments. She said, "Mum would have made a scene. Mum would have confronted him directly about what he said, so." She was right. Margaret would have. Margaret had never been good at the subtle approach. She would have called out David's cruelty in front of everyone. She would have made him explain himself, but I'd never been that kind of man. I'd always been the kind who thought things through, who looked for the angle that minimized collateral damage while still accomplishing the goal. I was never the dramatic one. I was never the confrontational one. I was the one who handled crisis by becoming very still, very focused. I was the one who thought several moves ahead. She said, "I don't know how I feel about this." I told her that was fine. I told her she could feel conflicted. I told her she could feel relieved and guilty at the same time. Those weren't contradictory. Those were just the realistic emotions of someone learning that their father had to protect himself from their husband's cruelty. I told her that sometimes consequences look like simple exclusion. I told her that people like David need to learn that actions have outcomes. I told her that I loved her more than I feared his reaction. And then I held her while she cried, because that's what fathers do, even when they're 67 years old and their ribs are aching, and they've just made a deliberate choice to exclude their daughter's new husband from the photographs that will become the historical record of the most important day of her life. What I didn't say to Sarah, what I saved for myself in the dark hours after the wedding when I was alone in my house, was that I understood exactly what I'd done. I'd made a choice to weaponize the administrative infrastructure of the wedding. I'd taken the tools available to me, the money and the legal arrangements and the vendor relationships, and I'd converted them into a form of accountability. I'd refused to let David's cruelty stand uncontested. I'd refused to participate in the fiction that a public insult deserved to be met with private suffering. I'd made a decision that I would not absorb this hit quietly, that I would not be erased from the historical record of my daughter's wedding, that my presence mattered enough to fight for, Even if that fight looked nothing like what Margaret would have done, even if that fight was conducted through spreadsheets and phone calls instead of confrontation and words, the thing that nobody really tells you about being a parent is that at some point, you have to decide how to teach your child's spouse about boundaries. You have to decide what you're willing to accept and what you're going to push back on. You have to decide whether your dignity is worth potentially creating conflict in your child's marriage. I'd made my decision. I decided that my dignity was worth something. I decided that allowing myself to be erased was not acceptable. I decided that the man who was now married to my daughter needed to understand that there were lines he couldn't cross without consequences. The photographs would teach him that. The family album, with its conspicuous absence of his image during the private moments, would teach him that. Years from now, when Sarah looked at her wedding pictures, she would see a visual representation of the fact that I had shown up, and I had mattered, and I had refused to be written out of her story, even when her husband had tried to do exactly that. That was my victory. That was my answer to his cruelty. That was the language in which I'd chosen to speak. David wouldn't find out about the arrangement until the proofs came back 2 weeks later. That's when Claire would send Sarah the preliminary photographs from the private family session, and Sarah would see immediately that her husband wasn't in any of them. She'd call me, confused and asking me to explain what had happened. I would tell her the truth. I would tell her that I'd made arrangements to ensure that the family session reflected the family that had actually shown up for her that day. I would tell her that David could be in the rehearsal dinner photos, the ceremony photos, the reception photos, but that this particular moment, this particular documentation of family bonds, belonged to the people who had earned it through unconditional love. Sarah would be quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she would tell me that David had already seen the preliminary images and that he was furious. He was calling his lawyers to see if there was any way to sue me, to recover his dignity, to force me to include him in photographs I'd paid for and controlled. The answer, of course, was no. I'd done everything legally. I'd purchased the rights. I'd made my requests in writing. I'd done exactly what anyone with resources could do to protect their interests and values. And there was nothing David could do about it except live with the consequences of his choices. The 2 weeks passed like a countdown I was watching from outside normal time. I went about my routine in the careful way people do when they're waiting for something they know is coming. I worked extra shifts at the hospital where I still consulted part-time, taking on cases that younger physicians hesitated to manage. I saw patients in emergency, and the familiar rhythm of crisis management kept my hands occupied even as my mind was elsewhere. There was something comforting about that, about stepping into a role where my judgment mattered and my presence was valued without question. I was 67 years old and still saving people's lives, and nobody was telling me to smile less or take up less space in those examination rooms. In the hospital, I was exactly as important as I needed to be. I thought about the photographs during those 14 days in a way that consumed my attention at odd moments. I'd be suturing a laceration on a patient's arm and suddenly I'd be thinking about Claire reviewing the images late into the night, selecting which ones would appear in the proofs, understanding the significance of the arrangement I'd requested. I'd be ordering medication for someone in cardiac distress, and I'd think about the preliminary photos being compiled, David's absence becoming more and more obvious with each image that came back, with each moment of family and team, AC that he'd paid for but wouldn't own. I thought about the exact moment when Sarah would download those files and see what I'd done, how her brain would process it, whether she'd understand immediately or if confusion would come first. I thought about the confusion first, the moment where she wouldn't quite understand why her husband wasn't in any of the family session photographs, the ones that had been carefully composed and lit and edited to tell a specific story about who mattered. I knew she'd call eventually. I knew she'd need clarification. I knew the answer I'd give would either fortify her or fracture her further, depending on how much of her mother's backbone she'd inherited, depending on whether she could understand that love sometimes looks like refusal. Love sometimes looks like drawing a line and saying you won't cross it. Sarah called me on a Tuesday evening around 6 o'clock, and I knew immediately why. Her voice had that thickness it gets when she's been crying, that particular quality that comes from tightened throat muscles and tear tracks she'd tried to wipe away. She said, "Dad, I need you to explain something about the photographer arrangement. No preamble, no small talk, just straight to the thing that had been eating at her for hours." I asked what she'd seen. She said she'd received the preliminary gallery from Claire and noticed something peculiar. All the family session photographs had been curated in a very specific way. Her with me in moments of genuine affection, Her with my siblings. Her with cousins and aunts and uncles who'd shown up for her without conditions. Her in one stunning image with me and her cousin Mark. The three of us laughing at something that happened naturally. The kind of moment photographers dream about capturing because it can't be faked. But nowhere was David. Not one frame, not in the background, not in a group shot. The absence was comprehensive and undeniable. She said, "How is that possible? He was there the entire time. How did the photographer exclude him from an entire session?" There was confusion in her voice, the moment before anger, when the brain is still trying to construct an innocent explanation. I told her it wasn't accidental. I told her I'd purchased the exclusive rights to the private family session composition, which meant I controlled every aspect of how those images were framed and who appeared in them. I told her I'd specifically requested that David not be included in those particular photographs, the ones that would become the official historical record of her family on the day she got married. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing. I could hear her processing. Then she said, "You did what?" I explained more carefully this time, the way a doctor explains a difficult diagnosis. I explained about the $42,000 I'd transferred to the photographer's agency. I explained about the phone calls I'd made in the hotel hallway while she was getting ready, while David was preparing to publicly diminish me. I explained about the legal agreements I'd put in place, the contracts that made my control absolute. I explained that I wasn't willing to allow myself to be erased from my daughter's wedding photographs by someone who thought cruelty was charm. Sarah's voice changed then, and I could hear her shifting into the role of a woman caught between loyalty to her father and the person she'd married. She said, "Dad, he's furious. He's already called his lawyer. He's saying you violated some agreement, that you can't exclude him from professional photographs without his consent." I asked if the lawyer had identified which agreement. She said no. She said David was just extremely angry and convinced there was legal recourse, some way to force me to either include him or return the $42,000. I told her there wasn't. I told her I'd done everything legally and carefully, purchased the rights and made explicit requests. I told her David's anger didn't constitute grounds for legal action. I told her I'd made decisions as the father of the bride about documenting important family moments, which was my right. She said quietly, "Mum would have handled this so differently." There was acknowledgement in that statement that I wasn't like Margaret, that I didn't respond to hurt with confrontation and drama. I didn't argue. I just said that Margaret wasn't here, and I had to make decisions based on 42 years of crisis management and the understanding that sometimes you have to be direct with people who won't respond to anything except consequence. Sarah said she needed to think about this, to process what I'd done and why. I told her that was fair. I told her I'd be here whenever she was ready to talk. She hung up, and I sat in my living room in the dark waiting for the next wave of the crisis to hit. It hit faster than I expected. David called my office the next day around 11 in the morning. He got my answering service because I was in a trauma bay with a patient who'd been struck by a car, focused on stopping internal bleeding and preventing organ failure. I listened to his message later that afternoon, standing in a hallway outside the emergency department, still wearing my scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and crisis. He'd left a message that was cordial on the surface but poisonous underneath, the kind of tone someone uses when they want to sound reasonable while expressing barely controlled rage. He said, "Hayes, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but these photographs are going to be corrected. My lawyer is looking into your options, which frankly are limited because you're going to lose. My image is valuable, and you can't just erase it from a professional record without consequences. I'll be in touch through my attorney." I listened to it twice more, then saved it. I thought about the language he'd used. My image is valuable, as if his image was the only thing at stake, as if Sarah's emotional well-being, as if the integrity of the family record, as if anything except his carefully curated image mattered to him. I wondered if Sarah had told him about what he'd done at the wedding, about the comment he'd made about me looking depressed in photographs, about the laughter that had followed. I wondered if he even remembered saying it, or if his brain had already reconstructed it as something more innocent. People like David had a talent for reframing their own cruelty as misunderstanding. The voice on that recording sounded angry, in a way that suggested he didn't understand the game he'd chosen to play when he made that joke. He thought money and position could still a man who'd already decided, standing in that hallway with $42,000 in a photographer's account, that he wasn't going to back down. The lawyer's letter arrived a week later on a Thursday, delivered by courier to my home address in an official envelope with the law firm's letterhead embossed across the top. I opened it while standing in my kitchen, reading the carefully crafted legal language about rights to one's own image, about contractual obligations, about potential remedies for damages. It was aggressive without being quite coherent, the kind of letter that sounded threatening but was essentially empty of actual legal merit. The letter suggested I'd violated David's rights by excluding him without consent. It suggested he was entitled to compensation for emotional distress and damage to his reputation resulting from his absence from the family documentation. It suggested that absence constituted civil harassment and potentially defamation by omission, which is not actually a legal concept but sounded ominous when placed in this context. It suggested I remedy the situation immediately by providing David with copies to disseminate, or face legal action for damages in excess of $50,000. I set the letter down and called my lawyer, Patricia, who'd been a friend for years and understood where the difference lay between legitimate claims and expensive harassment. I read her the relevant sections. She listened and said, "This is nonsense. He has no case. He has no right to force himself into photographs someone else paid for and contracted for. He can be upset, but upset isn't actionable. You didn't commit defamation. You didn't violate his privacy rights. You purchased a service and used it as intended." I asked if I should respond. She said to ignore it unless another letter came, and if it did, she'd handle it. She said this was David trying to intimidate me, trying to get me to panic and back down. She said people like him understood only one language, and that language was consequence. I'd spoken to him in that language, and now I just had to wait to see what he learned from it. Sarah started coming to family dinners again after that, about 2 weeks into the legal threats, and I noticed immediately the small details that indicated the state of her marriage. She'd bring her own car instead of coming with David, pulling into my driveway alone and walking up to the door by herself. She'd stay longer than she probably needed to, lingering over coffee and conversation in a way that suggested she wasn't eager to get home. These were the small observations that came from someone who'd spent decades noticing the minute details of human crisis. The 1,000 small signs that indicate when people are suffering in silence. They weren't communicating. I could tell from the way she no longer mentioned his day or asked about his cases or brought up the plans they'd supposedly made together. They were sleeping in separate bedrooms, or at least that's what I inferred when she mentioned offhandedly that she'd been taking the guest room because she didn't sleep well anymore and didn't want to disturb him. David's morning coffee was being made only for one, the coffee maker I'd given them as a wedding gift sitting unused on their counter, because they weren't sharing morning rituals anymore. She didn't mention the photographs for several weeks after that initial phone call. We'd sit at my dining table with my brother Tom and his wife Linda, and we'd eat the dinners I prepared with the same care I'd once used to save people's lives, with the same attention to detail and respect for the process. We'd talk about neutral topics like work and weather and the renovation project my brother was undertaking on his house, conversations that required no emotional investment and could go nowhere dangerous. But underneath all of it, there was the acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted in how Sarah understood her father. She had seen me protect myself. She'd seen me refuse to be written out of her story. She'd seen me spend money and leverage resources and make calculated decisions to ensure that I wasn't erased from the historical record because my son-in-law decided my face was an aesthetic problem. I think that frightened her a little, if I'm being honest. I think she'd expected me to be the kind of man who absorbs hurt quietly, who accepts dismissal with grace, who doesn't fight back but just accepts diminishment as the price of family peace. The inkling that I would fight back, that I had boundaries and was willing to enforce them, that I would weaponize my resources to protect my dignity, changed something in how she understood me as a person. I was no longer just her aging father. I was someone capable of consequence. 3 months after the wedding, Sarah told me during one of our family dinners that she and David had started couples therapy. She said they needed to work through some communication issues, some patterns that they'd discovered were problematic in the context of what she called a committed partnership. She didn't say that the photographs had something to do with it, but of course they did. They had everything to do with it. David had gone from believing he controlled the narrative of his own marriage, the story of what had happened and what it all meant, to discovering that there were people in his life, specifically me, who had both the resources and the will to contradict his version of events. He tried to erase me, to remove me from the historical documentation of his marriage, and I Dee responded by erasing him from the historical record of the most important day of his marriage. The therapy was David trying to understand how someone who was supposed to be insignificant, an aging father-in-law, a relic of Sarah's past, had managed to do what he couldn't undo. How I'd moved faster than him, how I'd thought farther ahead, how I'd outsmarted him. The photographs were developing prints now, the ones Sarah had selected for framing, the ones that she'd narrowed down from hundreds of options to the ones that meant the most to her. They'd be displayed in her living room for years to come. They'd be shown to guests who visited her house. They'd be part of the visual history of her life in a way that couldn't be disputed or rewritten or reconstructed by someone with a narrative H he preferred. They'd be proof, in physical form, that I had existed in that moment, that I had mattered enough to fight for, that I had refused to be diminished by someone who thought I could be dismissed with a joke and a suggestion that my very presence was unwelcome. David tried several other approaches after that reality became increasingly clear to him, after the legal letter had been ignored and Patricia had sent back a response explaining that he had no claim. He started being nicer to me at family events, which was its own form of cruelty because it was so transparently strategic, so obviously calculated. He'd make jokes about the photographs, trying to turn them into no big deal, trying to retroactively reframe what had happened as something that was actually funny instead of something that was humiliating for him, that showed him for what he was. He'd approach me at Sarah's birthday party and put his arm around me in that performative buddy embrace, trying to reconstruct our relationship as something warmer than it actually was. He'd ask me dire, seedy questions about why I'd done it, phrased in ways that suggested I was the one who'd been unreasonable, that I'd overreacted to a minor incident. He'd say things like, "I just want to understand your perspective on what happened," which was a way of saying he wanted me to justify myself, to apologise, to admit that I'd gone too far. He'd tell Sarah that her father was holding a grudge, that I was being petty about a wedding that had been months ago, that I should just let it go and move forward. What he didn't understand was that it wasn't about grudges or holding on to anger or inability to move past things. It was about establishing a line that couldn't be crossed without consequences. It was about saying that my presence and dignity had value, and I wasn't going to participate in a system where they could be dismissed like unwanted details in a photograph, like aesthetic problems that needed solving, like things that could be erased if they were sufficiently inconvenient to the right people. The legal threats eventually faded away into nothing, evaporating like they'd been made of smoke instead of intention. Patricia sent a response letter making clear that David had no legal standing, that he was pursuing a claim with no merit, that any further contact would be considered harassment. After that, the lawyer stopped contacting me. I think David's lawyer had probably given him similar advice early on, had probably told him that he didn't have a case and shouldn't waste more money pursuing it. I think David had probably come to understand, through whatever painful process was happening in his marriage, through whatever conversations with Sarah in their separate bedrooms or in their therapist's office, that he'd lost this battle. He couldn't force his way back into photographs he hadn't paid for and didn't control. He couldn't erase me from the historical record just by demanding it, by threatening it, by trying to browbeat me into submission. He couldn't make my presence acceptable by simply deciding retroactively that it was unacceptable anymore. He had to live with the consequences of his choices, the consequences of the joke he'd made, the consequences of his attempt at erasure, the consequences of discovering that someone in his life had the resources and the will to push back. He had to live with the knowledge that the photographs would exist exactly as they were, exactly as I'd designed them, exactly as they excluded him from the moments that mattered most, for as long as Sarah decided to display them, which would probably be forever. Sarah eventually asked me directly if I regretted what I'd done. We were sitting in my kitchen one evening about 6 months after the wedding, and she just asked it plainly without preamble or build-up. She said, "Dad, do you regret it? Do you regret what you did with the photographs?" I took a moment before answering because it was the kind of question that deserved a real answer, not a defensive one or a quick one. I told her that I didn't regret it, not in any meaningful way. I told her that I regretted needing to do it. I told her that I regretted that her husband was the kind of man who would publicly humiliate me in front of a crowd of people for no reason, except his own insecurity and his need to establish dominance. I told her that I regretted that she'd married someone who thought my face was an aesthetic problem that needed solving, that my presence was something to be managed rather than welcomed. I told her that I regretted the whole situation entirely, But did I regret fighting back? No, I would never regret that. I would regret it if I'd simply accepted Tertius, if I'd internalized his message that I was unwelcome, if I'd let myself disappear from her story because he'd decided that's what needed to happen. Sarah cried then, and I held her across the kitchen table, because she was finally understanding what her mother had always known, what Margaret had tried to teach her whole life. Sometimes protecting yourself means that other people have to live with the knowledge that they failed to hurt you. Sometimes refusing to be erased means that other people have to accept their own erasure as the consequence of their choices. That's how consequence works. That's what happens when you push someone into a corner and they decide, standing in a hallway with a champagne flute in their hand, that they're not going to stay there quietly anymore. The photographs from that wedding sit on Sarah's mantelpiece now, framed in high-quality glass and professional matting, displayed prominently where they'll be seen by every person who enters her home. She showed me them last month when I visited her place after she and David had started to formally separate, after she'd moved into her own apartment and begun the process of untangling her life from his. There's one of the three of us together, laughing at something genuine, our faces bright and real and absolutely unperformed by anything except the moment itself. There's one of Sarah and me alone, her head on my shoulder in a gesture of filial affection, both of us looking at the camera with an expression that David would have called depressed, but what I call honest, what I call true. There is one of me with my brother and my sister-in-law, the three of us in a moment of easy affection that you can't manufacture or perform or stage, that just exists because we belong to each other, and there are no photographs of David in that collection. Not one, not in a group shot, not in the background, not partially visible, nothing. He's completely absent from the framed gallery that will mark this moment forever for Sarah, and for everyone who sees those pictures. When guests come to Sarah's house and look at those images, they see a family that showed up for her without condition. They see people who loved her without requiring her to perform their version of success in return. They see a father who mattered enough to fight for his place in the story, who mattered enough to refuse the heir, Asia. They don't see her husband, and that absence is its own kind of presence. It's evidence. It's proof. It's the historical record speaking truth about who was there for her and who was there for himself. Maybe that's the most important distinction a photograph can capture. Not who was physically present in the frame, but who deserved to be remembered and who needed to learn what erasure felt like, who wanted to be loved without conditions and who only wanted to be admired. I think that's what I learned over that year after the wedding, through the legal threats and the attempted intimidation, and watching my daughter piece her life back together. Revenge, if you can even call it that, isn't as satisfying as people imagine it will be. It doesn't feel the way movies make it seem, like some kind of cathartic release or triumph. I didn't feel triumphant when I made those phone calls in the hallway of the hotel. I didn't feel vindicated when David found out what I'd done. I felt tired, mostly. Tired of having to protect myself. Tired of having to be strategic and careful about something that should have been simple, that should have been just a father being welcomed at his daughter's wedding. Tired of having to weaponize money and contracts to defend something as basic as my dignity, as fundamental as my right to exist in the photographs without apology. But I felt something else too, something that has stayed with me through every day since then. I felt clear. I felt like I'd made a choice that aligned with everything I believed about integrity and respect, and what it means to stand up for yourself when standing up is the only option left, when silence is complicity, when acceptance is participation. I refused to participate in a system that valued David's comfort over my self-worth. I refused to disappear quietly from the historical record of my daughter's life. I refused to accept erasure as the price of keeping peace with someone who had chosen cruelty. That's what those photographs represent. Not David's absence, my presence, my refusal to be written out. My insistence that I mattered enough to fight for, that I was valuable enough to take a stand. And when I look at them now, when I see Sarah happy again, starting her life over free from someone who spent so much energy trying to diminish everyone around him, I know I made the right choice. That was worth more than I could have paid for it, worth more than the $42,000 that I spent, worth more than the legal threats and the painful conversations and the temporary fracture in my relationship with my daughter. Because what I purchased wasn't really photographs. What I purchased was the right to exist, and that's something worth fighting for every single time.